Welcome to Outa Space, International Arts and Class Travel Podcast.
Hello and welcome. I'm Rob MacDonald, and today I'm joined by Josh, Becky, and Amy Freeman, who are the family of Jack Freeman. So, would you like to just briefly introduce yourselves and who you are?
Sure. I'm Amy Freeman. I'm the youngest of Herb's Freeman's three children, and I live in Albany, California, which is a small town adjacent to Berkeley, which is a place most people know about. But I grew up in New York City until my late 20s or something like that. And I am the only three of my three siblings that is still working full time. So I have a job. I'm the director of programs at a private foundation in California. And yeah, that's me.
Thanks, Amy. Rebecca?
My name is Becky Freeman, and I am the middle child of Herb and Irene Freeman. And I am semi-retired. I am a nurse and a midwife. I've delivered probably 2,000 babies. I'm also an artist and trying to find a way to get back to doing more art. And I've been to Spain twice. And both times on Spanish Civil War commemorative events. So
Great stuff. And Josh?
I'm Josh Freeman. I'm the oldest child and nephew, niece of Jack Freeman. I'm retired now. I'm a family doctor and grew up in New York, as did my sisters. Lived for 20 years in Chicago, 15 years in Kansas City, time in San Antonio and Tucson, which is where I now live, retired. I have been to Spain several times. But once, which we can talk about later, on a sort of tour of battle sites in the Northeast in Catalonia and Aragon, and to look for my uncle, the place where my uncle was killed. He doesn't have a grave. So we can talk more about that later.
Okay, cool. Well, I mean, obviously we're here together because I'm the artist and the project manager of Solidarity Park, which is building a memorial project to the Ciudad de Barcelona. Your uncle, Jack Freeman, was on that boat. He survived, but was to die, maybe, what was it, a year or so later, I think in 1938. And I think it's just worth, before we get into talking about his life and the family and the effects on the family and these kind of questions, from my personal point of view, Jack's letter that he wrote, which maybe we'll talk about, was actually quite a stimulus for the project, because he recorded many of the things that we know about what happened on the Ciudad de Barcelona. But so maybe we'll come to that in a little bit to explain the story of what actually happened on the day itself. But with this podcast, I'd really like to sort of get an understanding of who Jack was, who the family was, what was going on in the time in his life, and a little bit more sort of depth and understanding. So, because I think many people need to understand who these international brigadistas actually were. So I don't know if one of you could maybe say something a little bit about what you know about your uncle's life before he came to Spain, and his work and those kind of things. Hey, Josh. Yeah.
So my uncle was quite young when he went to Spain. As my sister will tell you in a little bit, he was still 17 when he signed up. And so he needed a permission to get a visa to go to France. And my grandfather signed that, to my grandmother's dismay. He was a brilliant student in high school. And I say that not just that he was smart, but he did very well. And graduated from high school when he was about 15 and got, this is family lore, I can't prove, got a scholarship, what's called a Pulitzer Scholarship, to attend Columbia University. But this was then taken away from him because of his political activities as a member of the Young Communist League. So he attended City College of New York, which was kind of a hotbed of radicalism in the 1930s, and which had several people who went to Spain. There's even a plaque at City College. I'll send you a photograph of it if you don't have it, of people who were students and faculty who went to Spain. So Jack was brought up in a very left-wing family in the Williamsburg, Bedford-Stuyvesant section of Brooklyn, and very large number, if not percent, of the Jewish families, at least in that area, were left-wing socialists and communists. And so it provided not just a political outlet, but the sort of social ambiance, social environment in which he grew up. His parents, his father had actually split with the Communist Party of the USA and became literally a member of what was literally called the Communist Party USA opposition, which was
interesting.
They were followers of Jay Lovestone, who had been a former general secretary of the CPUSA, but who was kicked out by the Comintern.
Okay, so I mean, they were. So I'm sorry, we could go to. This is just interesting. So this opposition, what was it after the Russian Revolution, I presume, and was it connected around with Trotskyism and this kind of stuff, or do you know much about that?
It was well after the Russian Revolution, because the Communist Party wasn't started in the USA until 1920, and so this probably was, I don't know, late 20s or early 30s when the Lovestonites separated. I'm not quite sure what the issue was, but they certainly would not have considered themselves Trotskyites at all. Although my father, in the cynical, even as an older person, you sort of remember how you thought about stuff when you first thought about it. And he would say, my father couldn't take a position on anything until the Communist Party took a position first so they could take the opposite position.
Okay, so he's a rebel within the movement.
So his father was a painter. And then later became an officer, secretary treasurer of the Painters Union in Brooklyn. He, just a little more history, he was finally pushed out of the union, had a strong mafia connected portion. And after my grandfather, at great personal risk, testified against Murder Incorporated, which had ties to the union, in a federal court, he was pushed out of his job and went back at a fairly old age to being a painter. And so that was my grandfather. And that was the environment in which my uncle was brought up. So he was what we would call in the US a red diaper baby. He was never anything but a leftist, brought up in a communist household. His mother, who was increasingly not close to his father, although they never divorced, was very involved in the social activities of the Jewish Communist Party. She wasn't so political overtly, but her whole life and her family and her social environment revolved around Communist Party stuff. So my uncle didn't have to become politicized. He was always political. And he was very young and very idealistic. And as you mentioned from his letter about the Ciudad de Barcelona, he was a really good writer, which is one of the things that probably calls him to attention. He was young and not a tough guy like some of the people who went to Spain, who's slight, but he was able to articulate things in ways that were more sophisticated, perhaps, than those of the guys who wrote home and said, "Gee, life is tough here. Send some more cigarettes." So that's his memorial. He was trained as a map maker and scout. And one of the most important pictures we have of him is a photo of him in a trench doing that. And we have an oil painting, which was done by a Spanish artist commissioned by my grandfather, that sort of takes off on that photo. At some point well, I think I'll leave it at that. Is there anything, Becky or Amy, you want to add to that?
I was just going to add that they were really poor, and that definitely, that social economic condition fueled their political beliefs. And my grandmother was a person who worked in the garment trade. So when my father was little, he was, I think, a little over 6 years younger than Jack. She brought home piecework so that she could be home with him until he went to school. When he got a little older, she was able to go and work in the sweatshops, which Herbie wrote some impressive.
Herbie's your dad, yeah?
Herbie is my dad.
Names. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Sorry. So that's all I wanted to put in there. Just kind of the family situation. My father wrote. He didn't write a lot of memories, but he did write a memory that when landlords of these cold water flats, they needed to rent them, they would offer the first month free. And they were so poor that often my grandmother would move them into one of these other flats so she could get a month free. And in the middle of the day, and she would just leave a note in Yiddish for my grandfather with the address so he would know where home now was. So
interesting. Amy, do you want to add anything to this part?
I'm trying to think. I feel like they really covered the earlier part.
No, that's cool. That's cool. I mean, it's just giving everybody an opportunity to maybe say. I mean, one of the things I saw, it's interesting. You talked about was it map making and this, and I saw a photograph actually of the letter, and his handwriting was beautiful. It was like a piece of art, and. The other thing, when I look into Jack's sort of history, is he had a knowledge of languages, because he did translations, I believe, when he was there. So I think he had French and Spanish and even German as well. I mean, was that from his education? I mean, you say he signed up when he was 17, which is extremely young, eh? I mean, is that when he left for Spain? When he was 17?
Yes, I think right. Yes, because he did need his family's permission.
Yeah, but he was probably 8. So I think he went to Spain. Well, when did the city of Barcelona arrive in Spain? In early 37, right?
Yeah, May 37.
I think he was born in 1918 in January, in August. In August, because the same birthday as my grandson.
So yeah.
And so he was probably 18.
So he hadn't had much of a adult life, if any, beforehand. I mean, what was the situation like in that moment for young guys, where he was from? I mean, do you know much of the background? I mean, you said they were poor and they were struggling. I mean, was there jobs to be had, or he was in education? I guess with the scholarship he didn't take up.
At that point, education was the ticket to a more affluent life. And had he lived, he probably, he may have been an academic or something like that. It's hard to speculate what he would have done, but clearly he was.
He was the golden hope, I think. Herbie was still a kid, and certainly Herbie, my father, although he was really bright, he was not the academic performer of his brother or his first cousins, to whom he was also really close. So I think they had really high expectations of Jack as a boy, as being so smart, and as the firstborn. I didn't know that he spoke German. I reread some of his letters last night. I wonder if he picked that up because he was fluent in Yiddish. And I think that would have really given him a leg up. I remember years ago when my father, who was less fluent in Yiddish, but still good, when he visited my sister who was living in Holland for several years, he was able to translate signs in Dutch where they were similar to German, where it was similar to Yiddish. So I was really surprised at that, so much translation came through from the Yiddish.
Yeah, and that reminds me of the story about when he went to Cuba with George Cap, and they met some German tourists in Cuba who asked them if they spoke German, and my father said no, and George goes, "Oh yes, of course," and started speaking Yiddish, and they all had a conversation. So the other thing I guess that we didn't say about Jack and Herbie is that they were first generation Americans. Their parents were not born in the United States. They came over from Poland.
Okay.
In the early 1900s. So I think that's.
Yeah, that's significant, isn't it? I mean, it's they're immigrants and they come to the new world, as it was, for brighter things, and their elder son is very bright, looking like he's got a great future ahead of him, this kind of stuff. Your own dad's quite young still at that stage, but obviously I see when you read the letters, they're writing letters to each other. So obviously there's a powerful relationship. I've got brothers similar to that, so I understand that. So, I mean,
I'd like to add just a little bit.
Yeah.
The situation was the Depression. Right. So life was not too good anywhere. And life was never good in those parts of Brooklyn, which were very poor. As I said, my grandfather was a painter, so he had a job, but it depended on how much work there was. I don't think that union officials got paid that much money. But the entire environment in which my uncle grew up was sort of the Jewish communist movement in Brooklyn. And my father remembers saying one of the things that attracted him as a young kid, before he understood all the politics, to the Communist Party was that there were a lot of evictions and the sheriffs, marshals, deputies would carry people's furniture out into the street when they were evicted by their landlord. And it was the Communist Party members who carried it back into the apartment. And that was what impressed my father. My suspicion is Jack's knowledge of French and whatever Spanish he had before he went to Spain was learned in school. And he just was very smart and probably retained it all. And I suspect the German, as my sister said, was from the Yiddish.
I mean, that leads sorry, go on. I mean, that leads very well into, sort of the next question, really. And I mean, we kind of answered a bit of it, but it's like, what do you think Jack's reasons were for coming? You talked about the evictions and being from a communist Jewish family and, this kind of stuff. So it was in the blood, the world was in turmoil, in many ways. I mean, so some of those are answers for yourself, but what do you think led him to think, right, I'm off, I'm going off to this? What was it that drove him to make that decision, do you think?
I'm pretty sure it was ideals. He saw what was happening in Spain. He was devoutly anti-fascist, and he was young and idealistic. And, I don't know how much you know about brain development, but that prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until about 25. So decisions that seem, just like the right thing to do in the moment, if you had a little bit more, rational thought maybe you wouldn't do it, but it was just, and I'm sure that he had friends who were signing up and going, and I'm sure it was quite the conversation in his, in his communist group that he was affiliated with, certainly the students at City University of New York. And it's hard to speculate what motivates someone you never met, but that's what I imagine.
Becky, what do you think?
Well, I think from just having freshly reread some of the published letters, his group, his cohorts didn't have chats. They had meetings. They had meetings to discuss the proper way to make decisions and the proper ways to behave with one another. That seemed to be, even in Spain, they often had meetings. We didn't go hang out and have a beer because we were resting in a town. We had a meeting in a bar. But he he wrote a letter here where he's defending himself to his mother being so upset about him going, and asks his father to explain to her again why I'm here and why, no matter what happens, she has no right to mourn. After all, you've known me all my life. You know that I'm not the kind of guy who flies off the handle easily, or who is swayed into foolish actions by his emotions. I've tried to be level-headed, and what I decided, I think, I could not help deciding. Even now, when I realize more completely than I could have before all that my decision implied, when even before going to the front, I've already had a fascist torpedo show me what death means at close quarters, I still believe that although I've let myself in for some pretty tough going, still I did only what condition and conviction led me to do. So, and he was not yet 19 when he wrote that. So I think you're right, Amy. Young men want to do something. They want to change the world. They want to engage largely with other young men. But he was defending himself as really having thought this through.
No, it's fascinating.
So I would say also that he, all those things that Amy and Becky said are true. That's a great letter, Becky. I wonder if it was translated from the Yiddish, since he wrote it. Well, maybe he wrote to his father and our father in English, but he always wrote to his mother in Yiddish. But I think that he saw himself, if he believed that something was right, and other people were going to Spain, and people that he knew were going to Spain, that he would go to Spain, because that was the right thing to do. And there was no reason. And in some ways, this is a reflection of the politics brought to a personal level, which is, if I think something is the right thing for other people to do, then why would I not do it? And he did have there were obviously a lot of young men from the Williamsburg area who went to Spain, but some of them were actually his very close friends, some other members of the brigade. So,
Interesting. I mean, what do you know much about the journey that he made to Spain? Because I mean, there's often it wasn't easy. It wasn't really. They didn't want people going. And the people from places like Germany and Italy, they're completely clandestine. And we know a little bit about the people from the US and Canada. But do you know much about his journey to Spain?
Do you, Josh?
I thought this was Amy's piece.
Amy, okay.
We can add. Yeah, unmute yourself.
Amy, you're on mute.
Sorry, I actually don't know about his journey to Spain. I know he went by ship. I don't know what ship he went, but beyond that, obviously, as Josh said, he didn't go directly. He went to France. So,
I mean, I think a lot of them did go to France. I mean, I was reading a little bit of David Newman, and he's another of the families that we know. And I was reading his account earlier today, and he was talking about being with Abe, who was a very famous brigadista. And I think he was probably with your uncle, and they traveled through, they sort of met up in Paris, and the Communist Party helped them get down to Lyon, I think, and then from Lyon to Marseille. And then there was this sort of, they were meant to be clandestine, but they were completely obvious foreigners wandering around, trying not to look clandestine, and people wishing them well kind of thing. It's one of these sort of open secrets in the town, which actually might be why the ship was eventually, hit, because it wasn't very hidden. And I also understand that many of them were due to travel over the Pyrenees, but the border had been stopped at that moment. And so getting the brigadistas to Spain was done by ship, which kind of brings us on to the Ciudad de Barcelona, which is obviously central to the reason that we've been in contact with each other. And as I said at the beginning of the show, then, there was a letter that I read. I read a number of letters that inspired me to be involved in the project. And it was Jack's letter that inspired me to create the form, because it was the first time that I'd read that as the ship was sinking, that they sang the Internationale. And he's not the only one to say that. But I mean, would any of you like to tell the story that you know about the boat at this stage?
I have not recently reread the letters, so I can't say this, but this is the story handed down to me from my father when I was a little kid, was that Jack was on the boat, and according to the letter that he wrote to Herbie, his quarters, his room, whatever you call it on a ship, cabin, that's it, was right next to where the torpedo hit. So had he been there asleep, which he maybe on another night might have been, he would have been killed. But because he was at a Communist Party meeting in a different part of the ship, he was spared his life. So that's what I recall.
Yeah, that's what the letter says too.
Hearing from my childhood, and but also a little bit of hubris in that letter as well. Well, if that didn't get me here, nothing will. Never tempt fate, Jack. But so that's how I remember it.
The moral of that story is always go to meetings, eh?
Right.
Okay.
And stay to schmooze around with a few of the guys afterwards.
Yeah. This is interesting. Sorry, Jack, did you want, Josh, did you want to say something?
No, I was going to say what you said. And Becky, that Becky said they were always in meetings.
Yeah.
Yes, the meeting saved his life.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, yeah. So he tells the story of how they were in his cabin was hit, and that he was out, and that he was thrown about. He was holding onto the railings. That's similar to David Newman, who was with him, and others. And they actually got into one of those two lifeboats that
survived. Yeah.
Yeah. And because on the other side, I think obviously they couldn't get to them, and they were some of the first people in. And they also talked, I believe, about I think one of the interesting facts was the actual way when they got to the shore and how they were treated by the local people. And there's this story that's often talked about in Margrat, which is that there was a receipt from one of the bars for all the cognac that was bought for the brigadistas. So, obviously they were in deep shock. They'd lost a lot of their comrades. They didn't really know until that moment they were actually in a war, because up to then it's all it's all talk, isn't it? You know, and then you get torpedoed, and then it's reality. So, you know, when I put this podcast out, we'll put links to the letters and that kind of stuff that we can find, so people can sort of look further into it. Do you know what happened to him afterwards? After the Ciudad de Barcelona, what was his story from then on? Do you know?
Well, we could probably retrace this from his letters, so I'm not sure exactly what happened when. But he was kept behind the lines and not sent into battle in the earlier engagements of the Lincoln Battalion, which is really what it was, part of the 15th Brigade. But he was trained in those skills as a map maker and scout. And at some point, I'm not sure if it was before or after he had gone into battle the first time, he contracted viral hepatitis. So he was hospitalized and very sick for a period of time. And during this period, then you can see in some of his letters, some of the quotes in it, one of the quotes I just sent you, he was part of what were called the retreats, where the Loyalist forces were driven back across the Ebro to the east. And he talks about how horrible the conditions were. As we know historically, in the early summer of 1938, there was, I forget what they call it, the last advance, the opposite of the retreats, where the Loyalist forces threw everything they had to advancing back westward across the Ebro. And by reading some of the documentation, it appears that the government hoped that would stall long. They never thought they could beat the nationalists with the support, who had the support of fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, but they hoped that if they stalled long enough, one of two things would happen. But hopefully the European democracies, England and France, and maybe the US, would come in on the side of the Loyalists and support them. That didn't happen. And so quickly, as Franco brought up truckloads of thousands of people from the south, the Loyalists were pushed back across the Ebro. And in the Sierra Cabral and Sierra Pandol, just east of Gandesa, there's famous Hill 66. And I've been up on top of it, and there's no cover whatever. And basically, the Loyalist troops, who at that point were mostly British and American, were subjected to the Luftwaffe's practice of drowning people in bombs. Just bombing the heck out of Hill 666. My uncle and other survivors were able to cross the Ebro to the easier hills on the other side, and that's where he was killed, near Corbera de Ebre. I think that being a scout was always risky for the reason that sunlight glinted off your binoculars and made you a target for snipers. And we presume that's what happened to him, since this family story is that somebody, I don't know their name, who survived and came back to the US, visited my grandfather and said he was standing next to Jack when he was shot down in those hills. And I get mixed up as to whether they were the Pandols or the Cabral. One was on one side of the Ebro, one was on the other, but it was the one that was not where 666 was.
Okay.
So that's how he died. And it was only a matter of weeks before the international brigades were withdrawn from Spain that he was killed.
Yeah, so I mean, he was kept out of the fighting for such a long time, and then being a scout, I imagine that was quite risky business, because you're looking for those people, aren't you? At the same time as they have to be kind of advanced, to see what's going on and report back, and they have to move. And I don't know the military sort of structure of that kind of thing, but it's obviously a risky thing. So, and obviously just before they disembarked. So unfortunate in that regard. I mean, so this is what of Jack's life, really. I mean, a very young man. He starts out, goes idealistically, and joins a war, is in a number of the major battles and incidences, and obviously is lost. And that's his life. But really, as we know, one life is connected to all the others, And one of the things I'm interested in is what was the effect on your family? What was it, and particularly on your brother, who I guess was if he was 11 when Jack went, he must have been like 13, 14 or something like that, and you talk about being young and idealistic, but actually that's a big age to lose probably your closest role model. So, I mean, what was the sort of comeback, if you like? What was the reality for the family after the sort of, I don't want to call it this, but number one son, the first son, is lost. How's history played in your family?
Well, I think that Jack's letters reflect that his mother was really upset that he was in danger. And my father relates that he was really proud. It gave him a little cachet, among his peer group, that his brother was fighting in Spain. And we don't have the letters they wrote to him, just how he references them in his letters. And I think that it had to, having become adults ourselves and having children of our own in our family, we can well imagine how they would have felt as parents. And years later, my father came across a little leather address book that had belonged to his father, and written in the back in pencil, he had gotten word that where Jack fell, where he died, and may have been buried. And that, for my father, led to several trips of different groups of us to seek out that area near, is it Corbera, Josh? Near Corbera, near the Ebro, and trying to find that location. And at least when I went, my husband and I went to Barcelona. We had some friends living there for a while, and we went on a trip with them out to Corbera and ended up walking through farms. It was all olive groves, but when we hit the hill, we were shocked. We were pointed to the hill where the big battle was by a potato farmer, and the hillside, and as we climbed it, we found shrapnel everywhere. We found foxholes. We found trenches that were still there. So anywhere where they couldn't grow the trees, it was pretty unbelievable how much was still left from that era. For us, it was really moving. And so we imagined also that many young men's bodies were probably buried in that area as well.
So I was going back to the direct family impact, and really I just thought of this right now. My father's portrayal of his mother to us as her grandchildren, and she died when I was a baby, so I never knew her, but the way he portrayed her was sort of a very sad, depressed, angry woman. And I, now as an adult and just within this conversation, thinking about it, the loss of a son in that way, a son who was your light, is something you don't really recover from ever. And so I don't know how much of that aspect of her personality was there before Jack was killed, but it was definitely there after.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
that in turn had a big impact. I mean, all of it had a big impact on my father. My father, I think, spent his entire life trying to find out more about Jack, as Becky said, and how he died and why he did, and was very connected to the vets of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. I can remember all the time, going with him to the Abraham Lincoln Brigade luncheons, and then when I moved to California in my 20s, there was a big contingent of brigadistas here. Milton Wolfe lived less than a mile from my house. And so there was always a big Abraham Lincoln Brigade event in the Bay Area as well that I either volunteered at or went to. And I just think for us, I'm speaking for myself, my siblings can chime in, it was a legend and a lore, and he was a hero to us our entire lives. And that has gone down and been passed down to then our children and the next generation. So it is something, it's a history that we're very proud of and very connected to as a family.
Those are two incredibly insightful things, personal from Amy and the history of that hillside in Corbera from Becky. I'd like to just talk a little bit about both of those. First, my father, I think, first went to Spain on the 50th anniversary, which would have been 1986. And in 1995, my wife was invited to give a talk in Barcelona. And so my father came with us, and he arranged a tour of battle sites for us with a guy named Tom Entwistle. I don't know if you ever came across Tom. He's passed on now. He was a generation between mine and my father's, probably born in the 30s. An American, and a little interesting story, I guess. Tom was from, I think, Rockford, Illinois, and was a Marine in the 1950s. And then after the Vietnam War started in the 60s, he volunteered again, thinking now he should be a senior person. The kids shouldn't just be fighting that war. So he came from no left-wing political background, whatever. And he ended up as a guard in the Spanish embassy in Madrid, falling in love with the Spanish woman, and eventually just living in Madrid, moving to Spain. And he lived in Madrid. And at one point he was back in Chicago and hanging out in a bar called O'Rourke's. This is all interesting stories. And conversation with somebody mentioned that he lived in Spain. And the guy said, "Oh yeah, I was in Spain." And his name was Sid Harris, who was a photographer in Chicago, somebody born in England and later lived in Chicago, who was a vet. And so they talked about it a lot. And this guy, Tom, learned about the existence of the other side. And going back to Spain, became a scholar of the war and had access primarily to Francoist archives that were in Spanish that he could read, which many people outside Spain did not have. So he became, fan is the wrong word, enthusiast about the war and learned a great deal about it. My father met him in 85. And so in 95, he met us in Barcelona and took us on a driving tour through much of Catalonia and Aragon through, we started in Gandesa, which was near where my uncle was killed, went to visit the hillside in Corbera, where, as Becky says, I brought home pieces of grenades and rifle shells and stuff, still there so many years later, 60 years later. And we toured places like Belchite, which is still in ruins from that war, and Alcanis, and we never quite made it to Saragossa, but close enough, and to Caspe and the Sea of Aragon and the memorial that's there. So we learned a lot. I learned a lot about it at that time. Other than that, I would say that while my father had a lot of people that he knew pretty well who were vets who came back. My uncle's friends, Abe Smoridan and Saul Wellman from Williamsburg. Wellman was a commissar for the Lincolns, were people my father knew as well. His best friend, Ben Kaufman, had an older brother, Ruby Kaufman, who also had gone to and came back from Spain. Ruby was a little bit more of a typical guy you might see in the Army than my uncle. He was kind of a left-wing, gun-toting Union enforcer before he went to Spain. He was a number of years older. And I heard, his brother would say, he got mad at the leadership of the Lincolns, so he took his machine gun and left to join the Mackenzie Pompadours, which was the Canadian battalion, although I read also that the Mac Paps were more than half American anyway. But the true story was that one day Ruby Kaufman woke up and found himself under a pile of dead bodies. He'd been thrown into a pile of dead bodies, except he wasn't dead and had to dig himself out from that. So these were all people my father knew and kept in touch with. But I think it was later in his life, probably at least in his 50s or 60s, that he got very involved with the veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, buying every book that had been written, searching through the archives of the Tenement Library at NYU, previously at Brandeis, and really getting it involved as he became more retired, did less with work, more focused on finding this out. My sister has a story, which I'll let her tell, about his interview that he gave, discussing whether he would be interested in knowing where his brother's remains were.
So, yes, he did an interview for a radio show. It was an hour. It was a very long interview, and I'm sure I have the link somewhere to it. I don't know where it is, but it was around the time that the graves were being exhumed and people's bodies were being found and reunited with their families. And the interviewer was talking to him about that. And, you think your family and what they think and how they feel about things, but sometimes you hear things that are really surprising. And he was talking to my father, and he asked him what would it be like for you if your brother's body was exhumed and you could have his body back? And I was sitting there listening to the interview. Sure, he was going to say, it would be nothing. But what he did say was, well, I think that they should find the Spanish soldiers first. I'm not thinking that they should go looking for my brother. But if my brother's body was found, it would bring closure to me. And I was really surprised, but he said that. So it was there was a piece that was never a business that was never finished for him, in a way, by not having that reconnection. Another thing that I just remembered as we were talking earlier is one of my father's visits out here to California. He wanted to talk to Milt Wolfe about my uncle because Milt knew him. He was a big commander guy and Jack was just a kid, but he was, because of the work that Jack did, he was around the commanders. And so we went to visit Milt at his apartment in El Cerrito, which is the next town over from where I live. And he and my father spoke, and I guess he was still drinking because they had a drink. And so it must have been a while ago. Wow. And Milt did vaguely remember Jack, and if he didn't, he faked it pretty well for my father. And it was just a really interesting conversation, and also a time that I think another time that he got to meet one of his heroes. I mean, I know he probably met him before, but just sit down for an hour in someone's home and, have a drink together and talk about your brother was really powerful.
I mean, all those stories that you've shared with us, I think they're powerful, and they're powerful also because, I mean, people's graves are important for closure, for understanding and these kind of things. But the Spanish Civil War is one of the, I think it's almost the most hidden graves still. They're still uncovered, and many people here, it's still a big issue. And I think, one of the things that's quite important about the project we're doing and these stories that we're talking about today is there's a real necessity to uncover this history. And it's not happened. It's not like 10 years after the war, there started to be an understanding. It didn't. Franco was in power for a long, long time, and it was closed. And then the transition period afterwards, it was all hush, hush, and let's not talk about it. Let's, brush it under the carpet kind of thing. And now there's a lot of problems with that come out today in Spanish society. And it's not, when you talk about finding shrapnel and bullets and stuff like that on the site, this is an indication of these places. They're sort of not touched, they've left to rot, and they're only now are we uncovering them. It's also, I think for a lot of Catalans and Spanish people, it is their story, but it's also ours, and it's definitely yours. And I find your stories there, very, very important and very emotional, really. But the other side of it is, I mean, your uncle was a working class hero. And there's no other ways of putting it. And I can imagine that your dad was super proud of that, and the fact that as he gets older, he looks into the history, and, you have to understand your own life through the people you love, don't you? And even the people that have been taken away from you. And obviously, when you talk about the graves and all this stuff, one of the things about the monument is to give, not a grave, but it's to give something more solid, something that's got, in a way it's a grave, but the way we've tried to do the project, we've tried to make it alive, in the sense of we're trying to, this isn't like, let's build a big concrete block and, go and see it once a year. We're actually trying to make this project something that people are involved in, and actually draws out the history. And really, this sort of brings me to my last question really for you is, what do you think about the lessons of the Spanish Civil War are today for Americans, or for people in general? What would be, this has affected your whole lives, it's been powerful, and it's lives that went before yours, really. But what do you think are the lessons for humanity and even for yourselves as a family? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. One of the things that it did to my father, I was just thinking as you spoke, and that Jack was really a working class hero. And having died young, he didn't have the opportunity to disappoint anyone later. That my father, even into his 90s, felt like he had that to compare himself to. So even though he spent a life committed to social justice and activism, he felt like he had not done anything important, really important. We didn't agree with him, but I think that was one of the legacies from the Jack story. In other ways, I think we all have an eye on not just looking at the history of it, but looking at what's happening now. What are the issues now? What are the fights now? Amy and I went with my father and my nephew, Josh's son, to the commemoration in Spain in 2006. We went to Madrid and Zaragoza and Barcelona. And there were lots and lots of celebrations and parties and lectures, and there were maybe 20 veterans of the international brigades, and everybody else was family and accompanying. But one of the vets from England in the Barcelona celebration, in his wheelchair, they asked him to go on the stage and say something. And basically he said, it's all well and good to recognize the anti-fascism of the Spanish Civil War, but what's happening now? What are we doing in Iraq? Why are we just talking about history? What position, what activities are we taking now? And he was well into his 90s. And so that's what I think the take home is for us, and has been, is what our, how much backsliding there's been, how much return to really, really frightening right-wing fascism there's been in Europe and America and other countries. So that's my piece.
Yeah, that's. I think that's really important. Amy, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I think that, I think that it's important to speak truth to power, and that to remain steadfast and solid against tyranny and oppression, and that history is important to look at when we're shaping the future. I mean, I think if I think about what's going on with what the press is calling the racial reckoning in the United States, and I look at this country that was built on a legacy of genocide and slavery that has completely othered the two populations, the indigenous population and the population of descendants of African people who were brought here to build this country and waged war on them. It's important for us to look at, those things, all the things that keep people down and oppress people, to work just locally and globally on making the world a better place for future generations. Where, I guess that's all I have to say about that.
No, it's important, definitely. Josh?
Yeah, I endorse all those things. It's an ongoing fight, and the echoes and the similarities keep coming through for some time now. And I begin to talk about Europe, partly because maybe it's more stark there in some ways, and mostly because I don't know as much about it. But in the United States, we've talked about the armed right-wingers who were most obvious in their storming of the Capitol, but have been around for a long time and are ubiquitous. And their supporters, not even the people who are not actually doing it, who believe nonsense, like it was left-wingers, anti-fascists who stormed the Capitol. I mean, they believe complete fantasies, and how reminiscent they were of 1930s Germany and the SA. And in those days, there's street fights between the communists and the Nazis, which the Nazis eventually won, and how it's eerily and scarily reminiscent of that. But in some ways, it's also reminiscent of Spain. When you look at what we've been through, where Joseph Biden and the Democrats were elected by the skin of our teeth to get rid of the Donald Trump administration. Does that remind you a little bit of the election of the government in 1933 in Spain, which was a coalition government of liberals and leftists and working class? And does the reaction, Amy talked about our need to confront a country built on genocide and racism, but it's also not gone. I mean, in this country, Jim Crow is back with a vengeance. Just yesterday, the Georgia legislature and the governor passed laws to restrict voting that could have come right out of a 1940s playbook of Strom Thurmond and the Dixiecrat Party. Nothing is ever dead. Nothing is ever defeated. The war is continuous. So it's, to me, a little scarily similar. You know, the issues, we don't have Carlists exactly. We don't have Royalists. We have some church stuff, not so much the Catholic Church, which happens to be led by a relatively progressive pope now, but evangelical churches in the United States who were ardent Trump supporters and give a religious veneer to the right-wing movement, just as the Catholic Church did in Spain in the 1930s. So nothing is ever new. The struggles are the same in different forms, but the key issues of the people, you know, and none of us have to be told that it's all in the interests of the billionaires and the corporations, you know, that who have recruited these shock troops to fight in their interests. So it's really a lot the same, you know.
Yeah, wow. Well, I think that's a great way to end it. And it's a battle against the billionaires, because in fact they were socialists fighting for a cause to change the world. And I really thank you for sharing some of your family history. You know, unfortunately or fortunately, it's all of our history. It comes through your family. I really appreciate you being on the show, and hopefully, you know, some of the things that you've said will hit home to people, because as you quite rightly pointed out, the battle against fascism and the far right is far from finished, you know, and therefore there's a responsibility on us all to take up that battle and to continue it. So thanks very much. And I look forward to seeing you in Malgrat de Mar at some point in the future, hopefully very, very soon.
Hopefully soon. Thank you.
Hopefully soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Good luck.
All right.
See you
Bye-bye.
now. Bye.
Nice to meet you. Take care.
We hope you enjoyed the show. If you have something to say to us, then join our Facebook group or contact us at outaspace.com. That's outa-space.com. See you soon.